Dave, great to see you. Don't worry, this guy is not going to bother you anymore, you know. I could understand he has some kind of crush on you or something like that. Don't worry, we're here, we have a good security, so nothing is going to happen to you.
I don't mind stalkers as long as they're interesting.
Hey, that's a good one. Okay. Dave, I saw on your blog yesterday that you managed to meet with Hillary Clinton when you were in Shanghai. I saw a nice picture of you.
Yeah, I guess I was doing the stalking there, so we were very fortunate. It's kind of funny that I travel 6,000 miles away to meet the Secretary of State from my own country, but I guess she was spending time in Beijing, and a friend of mine in the State Department helped arrange a quick visit with her.
Okay, and I understood that you managed to talk to her and to tell her about
about Startup Visa. It's a project that I've been working on with Brad Feld and Eric Ries and Shervin Peshaver, some other folks in Silicon Valley who are venture capitalists and angel investors and entrepreneurs. And it's really about trying to make the U.S. more competitive in ways that allow non-U.S. entrepreneurs to come into the country. We're trying to make immigration a little bit easier for people who are talented entrepreneurs who can raise capital to come to the country and really help create jobs. I think the U.S. has historically been very open to immigrants, and unfortunately that's changed a little bit in the last 10 years. But we still think that it's a great place for people from all countries to come if they want to start doing business. And I think that works both ways. But it was a great opportunity to give her a quick pitch, an elevator pitch. Usually I'm on the other side of that. And basically tell her what we were doing, and hopefully she's interested in helping us.
Okay. I understand that this is your first trip to China. Third trip to China. So I'd like to understand why a prominent investor and blogger and a social networker as yourself, why are you so interested in China to come not only yourself this time, but also with a geek on the plane, so you're managing to bring with you like 20, 30 people?
We have about 25 or 30 people, actually about 40 throughout the whole trip.
40,
but,
wow.
Yeah, well, I like to throw a party, and so it's more fun to go traveling with other people. I've always sort of been fascinated with just Asia and travel in general, and I guess while I'm also doing these trips to Europe, to me, really where a lot of innovation and excitement is happening, is in Asia generally, and India and China in particular. And I don't know too much about the country, so for me, I spent much of my years in my 20s and 30s working on my own companies and startups in Silicon Valley and working with other people there. I didn't get to travel as much as I would have liked. But my wife is Japanese, my kids are learning Mandarin and Japanese and English. I have friends all over the world, and really in the last 2 years in particular, have visited probably about 13 or 14 countries and gotten to know entrepreneurs in Asia and Europe, in Canada and US. And I think, as much as everyone thinks Silicon Valley is where a lot of things happen, talent is everywhere. And really, I think many of us in Silicon Valley get a little too comfortable sitting on Sand Hill Road and not doing as much, work in the trenches and finding interesting places around the world where entrepreneurship is happening. So even though I'm unfamiliar with the language, hopefully my kids aren't. I really think it's important to, stay abreast of what's happening in, hotbeds of entrepreneurship around the world. So, Beijing, definitely. I think probably Israel and India. Possibly Brazil these days too, and maybe Eastern Europe. In addition to Silicon Valley, I think there's many places where really exciting stuff is happening. And even if I'm not investing here right now, although I may have just made my first China investment about a half hour ago, we'll see. I think there's a lot of interesting patterns that you can learn here and apply to your own market, and maybe in the long run I'll start to know enough about China that I feel comfortable investing here as well.
China as an ecosystem for entrepreneurship and innovation compared to Silicon Valley, I'd like to have your views on that, because you have now, I would say, probably very good first impressions on China, because you came for quite a few times already, and you have a strong experience of Silicon Valley. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I hesitate to say that I'm an expert enough to, make too many pronouncements. I have a few friends here, and I've met a number of folks last year and this year. What's obvious to me is that there's a ton of innovation happening in China, and in Beijing in particular, and the pace of innovation is just probably unparalleled anywhere in the world. I would argue probably right now Beijing is working at a faster pace than Silicon Valley, maybe I think the one advantage that Silicon Valley has is probably there's just a history of entrepreneurship there that's been going on for quite some time, and probably a good bit of diversity there that might be a little bit different than what happens here, but certainly just the incredible economic development opportunities in China, the number of people who are online here in both mobile environments and others, and kind of the intensity of activity is really just, I don't think you can afford to ignore what's going on in China, at least to watch and learn from what's happening there. I do think it's difficult if you're not a local language speaker and somebody who's really invested in the area to do investments here. So I think it's been probably not that likely for a lot of U.S. investors to be successful here, not so much because of rules or regulations or other things, but just because they don't make the investment fully here. But for those who do, I think it could be very rewarding.
Well, actually, it's funny. I was showing that for lunch at lunch with Mark Suster, but my friend Fritz Demopoulos, who's running a CHINICT here, was telling me that actually the fact of not speaking Chinese here can be an advantage, because you tend to pay more attention to the body language, and on top of that, according to him, it's harder to be lied to in a foreign language.
Well, I think one thing that I've observed in Silicon Valley is that great entrepreneurs are people who break rules and don't follow rules. There's a lot of people who are not normal in Silicon Valley. Sort of interesting is that California in particular is kind of like the end of migration patterns from the rest of the world. If you look back, over several hundreds or thousands of years, people tend to emigrate from, sort of Eurasia into these other environments, and then in the U.S., from east to west, and then more recently, a lot of people from India and China into California. So California is sort of the last place for crazy people to get to. And there's this huge concentration of crazy people in China. So we tend to be more accepting of people who want to do crazy things and take it for granted. It's like, oh yeah, of course you're going to build a rocket ship to the moon, or you're going to build, this electric car, or you're going to build something that, saves the world and turns it green. And I think that is really important, that being able to be comfortable in sort of insanity is good. So maybe, someone who comes to China who doesn't speak the language, that's the same version of insanity here, and that those people who are not following the rules have some opportunities. But I think I'd like to be an insane rule breaker and still understand the language.
I understand. I used to follow your activities on your blog, which is very popular. I was one of the followers, and also on Twitter. And I used to see this crazy graphic about how venture capital in Silicon Valley was getting kind of revolutionized and so on, and it was kind of complicated for me to understand. Fortunately, we had a lunch together earlier, and you explained to me about the way you were seeing this drastic change actually in the way venture capital is done in Silicon Valley.
Well, I still think it's changing. I think that a lot of existing and larger, older venture capital firms are facing a lot of challenges just because financial returns over the last 10 years have been really shitty for a lot of venture capital firms. They're not even keeping pace with the rest of the market. Most of the limited partners, institutional investors who are investing in venture capital, they've been hurt in the public markets. They're less liquid, so they're really looking at asset allocations and pulling back. But aside from all the financial upheaval that's been happening, I really think, at least internet investment is dramatically changing, particularly in the last 3 to 5 years, and I'll explain why. So historically, venture capital has really been a kind of high financial investment opportunity, CapEx intensive, around 2 primary things, product development and customer development, customer acquisition. So historically, you'd have these hardware, software, manufacturing processes that would require a lot of investment, and then typically a long sales cycle that might be enterprise sales cycle focused. So you'd have a lot of money in building the product and a lot of money in the selling process. Whereas right now with internet investment, really it's both cheap and fast to build many services, whether they're consumer or small business at the very least. So you can, for the price of maybe 3 people for 6 months, you might be able to get a basic prototype off the ground. And in Silicon Valley, that might be $50,000 to $100,000 or less. In other parts of the world, it might even be $10,000 or less. So the product development process is very capital efficient, and at the same time in the last 3 to 5 years we now have, at least in the US and English speaking countries, probably 5 major platforms of 100 million users or more. So Facebook, Twitter, Google for paid search and organic search, YouTube if you consider that a separate platform, and now Apple on the iPhone and iPad. So 4 or 5, maybe 6 platforms of these 100 million users, some of which you can acquire virally or organically. So customer acquisition is now much faster, much cheaper. In some cases it still costs, but it's at least predictable. So both these 2 things that have been capital intensive in the past, the product development process and the customer acquisition process, they're cheaper, they're faster, they're much more able to be learned from on a feedback loop. And that really has fundamentally changed what's going on in investing, because you don't need $5 to $10 million to get many of these companies off the ground anymore. For really less than $1 million, you can get the product built, and probably for $1 million or less, you can get a reasonable amount of customers. So the changing face of venture capital, I think, is becoming much more nimble, much more of a singles and doubles hitters game rather than home runs, to use the American baseball analogy. And so I think being, a smart investor in Silicon Valley these days, and probably even around the world, really requires a much different approach, much more analytically driven approach, and a quantitatively aggressive approach. So I think that firms and companies that are making more like 50 investments a year are probably more well-positioned. 50 investments, say, at $100,000 than 5 at $1 million or 1 at $5 million, which I think has been traditionally what venture capital has done. Sorry for the long-winded.
No, that makes perfect sense, and that's very interesting. The thing is that basically it's the venture capitalists all of them might not like you very much, because it's much more work and much less money, if I understood. So, because the overall size of the fund is going to be smaller with the approach you have, so that means less management fees, but at the same time it's more investment at a much earlier stage. That means more support. So
well, I think it requires a different approach. I don't think that it scales linearly with the number of partners who are doing the investment. I think it scales with the available resources that you bring to the table. So for the type of work that I'm doing, it's more operationally focused around the product development, design, and marketing distribution process, and finding the right resources to help with those tasks and making those available to companies is really part of my job.
I think that our time is over now. Thank you so much for sharing this view.
Thank you.
And I would like to take the opportunity of having Dave next to me on stage. To remember everybody that we are co-hosting our annual cocktail, the Chinese tea cocktail, with Geek on the Plane tomorrow, starting at 4. It's going to be a champagne cocktail. There are, as Rich was saying, plenty of BlackBerry phones to win, as long as you are there and as long as you leave your business cards in the lucky draw box, and as long as you are lucky, obviously. All right, thank you.